We're going.
Oh, damn. You start with your name.
Hi, I'm Aiden Walter.
I'm Spencer Bjork. We are here with.
Henry Szymanski.
It is April 13th, 2023. All right. So our first question is, how did your parents meet?
My parents met following the completion of World War II. They were liberated by the Western Alliance forces, and during the war they actually were enslaved to the German war effort in different mechanisms. But they met after the war, and what was set up after the war were internment camps for the refugees that could not or would not go back to their original home of origin. And that's in one of those camps, that's where they met. My dad was actually an altar boy and wound up going around with a priest that wound up going from camp to camp to do services and all that stuff. And at one of those camps, he met my mom. And that's where they then ultimately got married and lived a life for effectively 5 years before they immigrated here.
So you said that you were born in Germany. Do you have any memories or stories from when you were there?
No, none whatsoever. I was 6 months old when we left Germany and immigrated here. So no memories at all.
Do you have any memories from immigrating to Milwaukee or stories?
Again, none, because again, I was just 6 months old and I was inside of a cradle that got carried around from airport to train to the house. So,
Was there a reason that Milwaukee was picked as your destination?
what was common in the internment camps was for those fortunate enough to have sponsors in countries that were receiving immigrants to be those that as soon as they got into the new country to turn around and sponsor the next family to be able to come. And my parents got to know several people in the camp that they were at, and once that family, one of those families got here, they turned around and sponsored my mom and dad, and therefore myself, to come to Milwaukee.
Did your family end up sponsoring any families?
No, we did not. We did. My mom did offer to have some of her remaining family members come here, but they chose not to come.
So when you first came to Milwaukee, did you have to live with other families, or were you set up in a house?
Actually, the first apartment that we lived in was effectively on kind of like Fifth and Lincoln, and it was just the back of a dry cleaning place. And that was kind of a temporary place till my mom and dad found an apartment. And then I don't know how long we stayed on Lincoln Avenue, but what I do recollect as a young kid was living on 14th and Rogers. That's primarily where I grew up the first 4 years of my life.
So, what was your first language that you had?
Well, it was Polish because I mean the neighborhood that we lived in was predominantly Polish, and everybody that, including my mom and dad, they spoke Polish, and there was very little English that I otherwise heard. So it was just natural to pick up the Polish language.
So was it a struggle at all, only being able to speak Polish at the start of your life?
I didn't notice it myself because until I actually moved from that neighborhood on 14th and Rogers to the 2900 block of 8th Street, where I then encountered people that only spoke English. And there were very few people that spoke Polish, and that was a bit of a challenge initially to wind up making contact and outreach to kids in the neighborhood.
So you talked about a friend that you had, John,
Yes.
and that his grandpa taught you English.
Yeah, he was effectively my interpreter. When I sat down and tried to talk with John, I would wind up saying like sugar, and his grandpa would wind up responding in Polish. So I would then begin to understand what the translation of words were, and that's how I effectively spent my summer as a 4-year-old learning the language through John's efforts and his grandpa.
Was John's grandpa originally from Poland?
I'm not sure. I think he was. I'm pretty sure he was. I don't know that for certain. I can't attest to that. But I know he had been here for a long time as a baker and worked as a baker and knew the language very well.
So you said that he was your interpreter. Did he offer to teach you English?
No, it just became kind of a natural thing, him sitting in the chair and John and I sitting on the floor of the porch and, exchanging conversation, trying to exchange conversation and learn about each other in the neighborhood and stuff. And it was just part of what he was willing to do.
So was John your first friend that you made here?
On the block, yes. Yeah, would have been on that particular neighborhood and block, yes.
So, so growing up, what was like a normal day like in the summer?
In the summer, well, first off, there were a lot of kids in the neighborhood, a lot of kids. There were a lot of families with kids, and they were not small families by any stretch. My sister and I were probably one of the smaller families. It was just the both of us. So kids were always out in the streets or in the alleys playing some kind of game. I mean, you could always count on being able to walk out and get into a wiffle ball game or a foursquare game or pee-wee football or any of those kind of things that you can pick up and play in the yard. Kick the can. I mean, we had extensive opportunities to play kick the can late into the night because we had good neighbors that allowed the kids to hide in their yards. So that's what I recollect pretty much about that, early growth.
So you talked about your neighborhood as being very Polish. Was it Polish ancestry or like they were from Poland originally, the families there?
Well, on 14th and Rogers, they were probably mainly immigrants that were populating that particular neighborhood. On 8th Street, it was largely a blue-collar working neighborhood. And again, there were some people that spoke Polish, but it was much more in a minority than on Rogers.
And so, what grade school did you go to?
I went to St. John Canty Parochial Grade School. I went there from first grade through 8th grade.
And was that like your neighborhood school?
Yes, I walked to and from every day. It was effectively, 3 blocks away. So it was an easy walk.
And so, roughly, how many kids would you say lived on your block?
On the block,
Yeah.
I'm going to say easily 50, 60 kids. Easily. Because every household had 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, and wind up multiplying the number of houses on the block, yes, and easily 50, 60 kids.
So, from your school, do you have any like notable or fond memories?
Fond memories. Graduating. I mean, it was a mixed bag of stuff. I mean, it really was. Grade school was, learning. It was Catholicism to the max. We had Notre Dame nuns, so they were very strict about what you learned, how you learned. Fond memories were actually the teachers that I had that weren't nuns. I had some very good lay teachers. My 3rd grade and my 5th grade teachers were exceptional from my perspective, and I probably learned more in those 2 classes than I did combined with the other classes.
So you went to a religious school that was taught by nuns. Were you very religious growing up?
Well, yeah, because I mean, I was even an altar boy. I did that from 3rd grade through 8th grade, and actually even did a little bit after I graduated in high school. Was I religious? Only because of the participation in the masses and all of the programs that are part of Catholicism and their celebrations and stuff. But would I say that I was religious? Only by default.
Oh, so was it your choice to become an altar boy?
I was inspired by my dad, who again was an altar boy when he was a young man, and he's the one that actually taught me the Latin language of the Mass, because back then altar boys spoke in Latin. All the phrases and all the chants were all in Latin. So I learned all of that as a third grader, which was apparently unusual to have it all memorized by third grade. 'Cause one of the other guys in my class, Howard, and I were the only third grade boys that became altar boys. There were other guys that wanted to be altar boys, but they didn't know the Latin verses and stuff. So Howard and I got to be altar boys in third grade.
So from your school, do you have any like bad memories?
Well, I guess what was painstaking was to learn about prejudice, and prejudice for the fact that I was an immigrant. That was very disappointing to learn early on, and it left a stigma for those that I know wound up persecuting me for that, being that way. And those are the people that I stayed away from throughout, as much as I could, throughout grade school. So yes, that was kind of the unfortunate side of it, and that was a prejudice that I didn't understand, and then only in high school did I find out how much more prejudice and racism there was. So.
So what did your parents do for work?
My dad was a blue-collar worker at Patrick Cartier for 32 years, and he did a whole bunch of variety of things. What he did not want to become was a supervisor. He just wanted to do his job. And he did it, like I said, for 32 years. And my mom did some office cleaning early on, but then she wound up just really being a housewife and mother.
After you and your sister grew up, did she do anything after that? Or?
My sister wound up working for an accounting firm for a number of years. And then she wound up becoming the secretary for the Walworth School District. And she was involved in a lot of the administrative stuff that goes behind the scenes to run a school district. So she did that for, I think it was over 30 years when she retired here just a couple, 3 years back.
So were you and your sister close growing up?
Can't say that we were close. I mean, it was always looking for opportunities to not do stuff with her, but playing with dolls and all that kind of stuff did come into play. No, I can't say that we were close.
How about with your parents? Did you guys have a good relationship?
Yeah, all the way through. I think we did. Certainly supported the majority of what I wanted to be able to pursue. Yeah.
So, talked about the nuns and like teaching them. So, how would you say the nuns shaped your worldview?
Well, again, the religious impact throughout grade school left me with the understanding that the world was Catholicism, and then there were a few people that were outside of that, and by few people I meant really few people. And then I got to high school and realized that there were a lot more than a few people that were not Catholics. And that just opened up my mind to what was I really taught about, and why was I being chastised for making friendships with people that weren't Catholics. I mean, I didn't understand any of that, and it took me a couple years in high school to kind of process what that meant to me as an individual, continuing to go forward.
So would you say high school was probably your first like eye-opening experience, like
Oh
in the
yeah,
world?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then, you wind up getting your first job while you were working in high school. You wind up getting another whole bunch of eye-opening experiences, what it's like to work with others, and again, those interests of the others that you're working with. I mean, yeah, high school was a lot of eye-opening experiences.
What was your first job?
My first job was actually working at the corner butcher shop, cleaning his pots and pans. wound up approaching him because I wanted to wear special pants when I got into high school, and mom and dad weren't going to pop for those special pants, so I wound up working in the butcher shop to make a little money to get those pants. That was my first job, my first real job where somebody was actually claiming me as a worker and paying, the Social Security and all that stuff with it. Was at Cole's food store. At restaurant on 8th in Cleveland called the Prologue Restaurant, and I was a salad boy and an assistant chef. So that was my first real job. After that, I wound up going to Cole's food stores and was a stocker for a number of years while I was going to school.
So would you say that your high school experience was pretty good?
Yeah, overall, I think it was, sure.
Do you have any like fond memories that you can think back on?
Fond memories. Again, graduating. Again, there was a lot of good things about again the camaraderie between those that in certain classes, like my architectural drafting class was always a lot of good interaction with the rest of the guys that were in the class. The architectural design course, the industrial arts classes, those were always fun. Those were just enjoyable interactions. Did I really carry any friendships, deepening any relationships from high school, after high school? No, not really. I do still have good contact with John. John and I went to high school together. So we continue to interact and do things together that way. So, high school was okay. It was okay.
So, was your grade school co-ed?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so how was that switch from going to co-ed to boys tech, which was all boys?
I just shift gears and move on. It didn't affect me at all. I didn't think anything of it. There were still opportunities to interact with the other opposite sex at the swimming pools. It's ice skating, any number of different opportunities. So CYO dances at the time.
So you told us about a story about your first girlfriend that was not Catholic.
Yeah.
You want to tell us that story?
Yeah, well, ironically, I met Sandy at Kosciuszko swimming pool, and I started just spending time with her at the pool and then at her house, and wound up mentioning that to my mom and dad, and mom just totally freaked out when she learned that Sandy was not a Catholic, and she was Episcopalian, and mom wound up going to the pastor of the parish to ask him if I needed special dispensation because I actually had gone out with a non-Catholic. And this was a sophomore in high school, so this would have been 1965, 66 when that wound up happening. So that's what I've got to say on that one.
So did the kids from like your block that you lived at, did they also go to boys, or the boys, did they go to boys tech?
No, they actually, a scattering of them. John and I went to Tech. Our other good friend Jeff went to Don Bosco. Our other good friend Stanley went to Marquette High School. And yeah, that's right, John Kaczynski also went with us to Tech. So there were three of us that went to Tech, and the other guys went separate ways.
Right. So when you were around 17, the race riots and anti-war protests going on, did you take part in any of those?
I didn't take part. I just observed. The race riots were, shutting down the entire city and bringing in the National Guard. It was weird to wind up walking the neighborhood, and especially on 8th in Oklahoma, to wind up seeing the National Guard go by in the Jeep with their machine guns sitting on the back side of it, which was, again, just totally weird. My dad had difficulties getting back into the city from Cudahy because, again, Milwaukee was shut down, so he had problems getting back in. Um, the only good thing that I remember out of those first days of the race riots is that we got together at John's house and played poker with his brother and a couple of the other older guys and played poker. And I wound up winning a nice bunch of cash out of that. So that's what I remember, the good thing about the race riot itself. As for the war protests, I, I knew that they were going on. I didn't quite realize its impact and what was how strongly it was happening till my friend Stanley wound up going to Madison. And then I would join Stanley on a couple weekends in Madison and wound up then feeling the heat again of the National Guard and helicopters flying overhead to keep you pinned in to where you are and get you back into your dorm and all that nonsense. By 68, 69, I had already lost a couple friends from grade school, guys that I had been an altar boy with because of the war. John's brother was actually in the service at the time. So I had a lot of people that I knew that were in, and knowing what my parents had gone through, I wasn't necessarily in favor of the war. So.
So during like these protests, did it like change your life or how you viewed things?
Well, again, it just was great to wind up seeing the ability for us as a democracy to speak out against something that a lot of people were impacted by. Did it change me to do anything more about it? I can't say that it did. I just knew that I did not want to participate in the military, and would have chosen to do different things had I been pressed into that.
So you talked about your dad having struggles to get into the city. Like during these riots and protests, did you have to change how you got around?
No, no. Once they lifted the ban, we were able to get back to school and just get back on the city bus to go to and from school. But it did become aware of the resistance to the racial issues. There were high school was the first time that I had really encountered black people, and I didn't have any issues with them. They were, just another guy in the class, and we interacted that way. But after the riots, you could wind up seeing that there was a posture that was more pronounced as to, I'm a black man and you need to look at me because I'm a black man. And that was kind of difficult to process and digest. But you could feel it. You could see it in throughout the school. We all got along. We all, got continued to do our sports and studies and everything else. But there was a different posture. The NAACP was very active that way, and promoting, the recognition of blacks as, being humans just like the rest of us. So.
So you mentioned sports. Did you participate in any sports during?
No, I did not. I did intramural swimming and intramural basketball for my freshman and sophomore year, but beyond that, I did not do anything.
Other thing about sport, were you a big sports fan, like Brewers, Bucks, Packers?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to the Brewers. I never got to go to a game till I was in high school. Packers, yeah, on Sunday we would gather at somebody's house to wind up watching the game, but outside of that, was I an enthusiastic supporter where I would offend myself if I didn't get to watch the game? No, I still to this day I'm not that way. So
they were pretty prosperous during your time. Packers won a few Super Bowls.
Yeah, along the way they did. Yeah, I mean, certainly the first couple were impressive, especially the so-called ice bowl. So yes.
So when the Packers or the Bucks won their championships, how was that like in Milwaukee?
Well, it was, 71 was a lot of jubilation because again we had a very powerful at the time Lou Alcindor, or now we know him as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Just like Giannis today, a big, powerful basketball player that took the team and wound up combining that with a few good outside shooters and defensive play. Yes, we wound up having a great team, and there was a lot of jubilation, as I remember.
So, how did you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife? Well, I worked a block away from where Barb worked. Barb worked at the time for the Journal, and she worked downstairs in the public service lobby. Uh, Part of my responsibilities where I first worked was to do mailings, sending off stuff, and I would often use the postal substation that was in the lobby of the Journal to do that transaction. One day I wound up walking in at lunch with one of the guys from work, and I got a stiff elbow in the ribs, and Keith said, check that out. And across the lobby was this woman walking by. And as I'm watching her go by, I'm making a connection visually to her face being the same woman that I had observed on the bus stop that I wind up passing oftentimes going to work. So the next day I wound up working my way up to the public service desk because they provided you with maps and routings and tourist information. And I maneuvered myself to engage with Barb to get me routing to Florida. I was planning to go with my friend Stanley down to Fort Lauderdale. So Barb gives me the routing and just engaged in casual conversation as part of that. Wound up leaving, and the next day I circled that block 3 times before Barb got to that bus stop, and I offered her a ride, and she got in the car. So we have 2 steady lines that we use when somebody asks how did we meet. First off, Barb told me where to go, which is absolutely true because she gave me a map routing to Florida, or I picked her up at the bus stop. So that's how we met.
So, would you say that when you first got to know her and started dating, that she was the one for you?
It didn't take long after that. I mean, it didn't take long at all after that, and Barb will attest to that too. It was just a uniqueness about the encounter that just made it click. So.
So how long after you first met did you guys get married?
Yeah, it was 2.5 years. Yeah, March to August. Yeah, it was 2.5 years.
And where did you get married at?
We got married at Our Lady of Lourdes Parish, which is on Forest Home and like 59th Street.
So, what did Barb do for work?
Barb was initially, she was down in the public service area of the Journal. She then, as part of that, wound up getting moved into special events, and she became a special events coordinator for the Journal, doing things like the sports show. Back then it was a 10-day event. Al's Run was part of her work. A number of big projects. Employee picnic, they come in and say, here's the budget, orchestrate a employee picnic. So those kind of special events is what Barb did for a number of years, 30 years there. And then when the Journal started downsizing, she was one of those that left. And then Barb became director of Polish Fest for 3 years and did that till that got to be a little too much and taking care of her mom at the time. So she wound up effectively kind of getting away from working full-time and taking care of mom. And most recently, she kind of finalized working during the tax season with an accounting firm preparing taxes. So.
And then, do you guys have any kids?
We have one daughter, Hillary Ann. She lives here she lives in Wauwatosa, effectively on 84th in Wisconsin, just right in that neighborhood.
And does she have any kids, or do you have any grandkids?
Yeah, we have two grandsons, Emmett, who's 11, and Teddy, who is 7, 8. He's now 8, yes.
All right. And then, so you mentioned that you attended a 1-year, 2,800-hour course. And what was that for?
It was for architectural drafting. It was really to learn more about the depth and character of what it meant to put together a set of construction documents. And it was a technical school. I mean, it was a technical school, effectively kind of the precursor to Milwaukee Area Technical College, because you can get into, now 2-year programs that have about 2,800 hours worth of time in it and get a 2-year degree. Well, this was kind of a precursor to that and jamming it into 1 year of effort. So.
And did you always want to become an architect?
Well, actually becoming an architect was kind of the process through learning about the profession in and of itself. I was always convinced that I was going to just be a good draftsman and do the things necessary to put the documents together and know how to put something together. But then along the way, I wound up being asked to do more and more and getting me further away from that technical aspect of it and getting more into the management side of the work.
So, did you only have to take that course to start working, or did you have to take other?
Oh, I continue after I started working in an architectural office. I continued to go to evening school. I took electrical engineering courses. I took specification writing courses. I wound up doing HVAC design and construction courses. I continued to add that to my repertoire of knowing the profession as a whole. It's just part of what I continued to do, and then kind of along the way is where I started delving into the biological sciences, because I took a horticultural course in tandem with one of my architectural classes, because it was right next door, and that kind of put me on a track to work towards a degree in urban forestry at MATC. So just how stuff evolves,
Yeah.
and how interests come into play.
So, for the first 11 years, you were at 3 different companies. What was your role at these companies?
Purely as a draftsman. I will say that at the third firm that I worked for at Orkwood, I was being given responsibility to go out and do observation of the work in the field. But that was, again, part of a growing experience and growing responsibilities that you learned and were granted as you continued to move in the profession. But otherwise, it was primarily to be an architectural draftsman, being part of a team to wind up doing your part to deliver all the drawings necessary.
So, at these 3, the first 3 companies, designs that you were a part of?
Well, starting at the first firm, Northridge Lakes, the entire housing development was their big project. And that's where I learned very completely about what's called stick frame construction. So that's wood frame construction. So you wind up doing 1, 2, 3-story buildings of different variations and sizes, but the drawings necessary to put those together is what I was learning at that time. So again, Northridge Lakes phases 1, 2, 3, including the clubhouse, was what I worked on for those first years at Wensler's office. At Miller Waltz, the second firm that I worked for, I got to do detailing and drafting on Bucyrus Erie's office building. Now, no longer an office building, but the entire office building structure was part of what I was able to do on that. did a lot of housing at Miller-Waltz too. They were famous for going after military housing projects. So we did work for the Navy, for the Army, in different camp settings all across the country. I just did the work in the office, and the rest of the team, not rest of, but other members of the team actually got to go out to the field to wind up doing observation and punch listing.
So what were the reasons you left these companies?
Well, the first firm, they ran out of work, so I wound up being loaned out to Miller-Waltz, and after 6 weeks there, they said, "We want you to stay." And the first firm didn't have any work for me, so I stayed. And then the second firm was, I wanted to get away because they were being very poor at actually meeting payroll and paying consultants to do their portion of the work. And I didn't want to be a part of that any longer. So I wound up moving on and went to the third firm, which is Orbit.
So you said that you were at Kaler Slater for 36 years. What drew you towards them?
Well, actually, I got invited to participate. One of the guys that I started work with at Wensler's office, Lou, invited me to come and join the firm because he had been at Kaler Slater. And initially, I wound up enjoying what I was doing at Orbit and told Lou, I said, "I really like what I'm doing here. I'm going to stay here." And then 2 years later, Orbit decided to close their Brookfield office, so I didn't have a job. And I called Lou up and said, "Hey, 2 years later, is anything open?" And he said, "Ironically, we do have an opening." Wound up going down and interviewing with David Kaler and David Porfy, and ultimately wound up getting into the firm. Kaler Slater at the time for me was stepping into kind of the throne of architecture. They were the firm of design, and they still are, doing incredible design and doing very thoughtful engagement of the clients in the process to get to the best design. So that's what ultimately drew me there and kept me there for 36 years.
So when you first started there, did you know you wanted to spend the next 36 years at that company?
Well, I was certainly hopeful. I participated at levels including later becoming an associate principal in the firm and owning stock in the firm. That's when you wind up wanting to know that your investment is viable and you want to be part of making it viable. So yes, I figured out after a while that this is a place I want to stay, especially after I knew that I wound up going through better than a 4-year cycle and I was still had a job.
So did you start out as a draftsman at Kaler Slater?
Yes, I did. I came in with that, but I already had picked up at Orbit, I had picked up some additional drafting technology that Kaler Slater's firm hadn't been aware of, and it was kind of what's called overlay drafting, where you actually have, like doing a site plan. You wind up having a site plan that shows the building and the roads to get to the building. But then that's one drawing that just defines the road. You have another drawing that has the same background, but it needs to reflect how the utilities get to the building. And then there's another drawing that reflects how the grading, the contours work. Well, we wind up putting all that separate information on separate layers so that all you do is draw that building and the roadways one time and one time only. So that picked up on the efficiency of the drafting, and that's what I brought to the table at Kaler Slater, and everybody just kept saying, "Wow, why didn't we know about this a while ago?" So that's what I brought to the table and effectively kind of started training the rest of the staff to use that and how to code the sheets to make that final composition of drawings work for us.
So what was like your promotion wise? Like how high were you getting after a certain amount of time?
Well, at the end, I retired as an owner with Kaler Slater, and I had a title of being a project leader and a project team leader. So I wound up having an internal team of on different projects up to like a dozen people in-house. Then also being in charge of and coordinating all of the consultants that you need on a project. So I mean there were soils engineers, structural engineers, plumbing, heating, electrical engineers, acoustical engineers, any of those guys. I was the lead in engaging them and working with our team to solve problems and put them on a path to ultimately create, again, the documents necessary to build.
So, as they were the top designing firm, what were some of the most notable pieces that you designed?
Well, I did very little design. Again, I always took the designer's dream, the client's dream, and made it a reality through construction documents and then watching it in the field. I did a couple projects where I can say that I designed, but otherwise, notable projects that I participated in were like MATC's Health Sciences building on between 8th and 9th and Highland. Spectacular building. We wound up getting some awards for that. I did all the architectural work on that, including then the landscape design work for that. Marquette University's dental school was another project that I wound up being strictly the project architect on, and then did the field observation. Um, Yankee Hill Housing, the two towers downtown on Kilbourne, between, what is it, Broadway and it's the one to the east, off of Broadway. But those were very, very big projects for the firm, and those were some of my first projects at Kaler Slater, which involved taking those projects through all the permitting process and approval process with the city of Milwaukee and the state for that matter, because there were some code issues that we had to work through on that project. So I mean those were kind of some of the local ones. I have projects that I was involved with that are in Phoenix, Arizona, in Manhattan Island, um, in Virginia. I had a client while I was working and they still are working for, in Fisherville, did a very large cardiovascular expansion to their campus. The other big healthcare project was Beaver Dam Hospital, a full replacement hospital. It was like $100 million worth of construction. So like those are some of the bigger projects that I can wind up putting out there. I find myself an incredibly fortunate guy that wound up being able to do this breadth of work, because not everybody can wind up saying that they did 36 years of great architecture that way. So I put that out there.
So, kind of reiterating, what was like while making these designs, like what was your job or what were you meant to do?
Well, it was always interpreting the design, based on sketches, and wind up understanding how the window was going to meet whatever the outside material was, and what was needed to respect a design that says I want the window set back from the face or it's flush from the face, and what were the mechanics of making the joinery work between those two elements, understanding the physics of the materials between those two, and what you needed to keep the water, what you needed to do to keep the water from migrating into the inside of the house. Those were the responsibilities that I took on to then educate the rest of the staff and just continue to do the work that I know was needed to keep the water out, from keeping the firm from getting tied into liability issues, to and protect the name of the firm. That was another gigantic responsibility with these projects. So, yeah, it was. I think that answered it.
Yeah. Um, so you mentioned in our pre-interview about John Norquist. Like, so what role did he have in your life?
Well, uh, part of Kaler Slater's fostering was for you as an employee to also be involved in doing community service. So that's ultimately what I wound up doing here locally. The Hone Bridge at the time was referenced as the bridge to nowhere because it effectively wound up going south and ending at Car Ferry Drive, and it didn't have anything but the on and off ramps at Car Ferry Drive. There was always an impetus after that got built to wind up extending effectively an 8-lane roadway from the bridge all the way down to the state line. That never, ever got any real traction, but there was still a requirement to provide suitable and adequate connections to the bridge extending through Milwaukee County. So I heard about this public involvement opportunity, public hearing on the issue, wound up going down and heard about what they were proposing, including taking about 150 or so homes through Bayview and just obliterating the property to wind up squeezing in this new roadway. There were a lot of people that came to find out were in opposition to that roadway and its extent, and wound up being asked as part of those alliances that I had made to effectively chair what was known as the Lake Arterial Alternative Committee. We wound up petitioning the Department of Transportation to include an alternate that we were proposing in the study for the project for for their roadway. They were not having that, they would not accept our proposed alternate. Well, John Norquist, and I still to this day don't know how he exactly wound up finding out about the fact that they weren't listening to us, but he approached us and said, I hear you're having a problem with DOT. We explained what was going on, and he said, well, let me do this. I will get their attention. John at the time was a state senator, and he was the head of the finance committee. He proceeded to shut down all the funding to the project until DOT accepted a public involvement alternative. And that's where I met John when he was then a state senator. Wound up working with him at this table back then, and wound up working on an alternative plan that we wound up then submitting. Wound up submitting the plan to the department. At the same time, I continued to attend their public hearings and wound up posturing as part of what our plan in alternative was some aesthetic considerations for what they might do if, depending on the scale of their plan. That included the simulated Lannon boulders that are the bridge abutments along the roadway, to use Core 10 steel, the rusty steel, because again, historically, Bayview had the mill, the steel mill, so there was always kind of a rusty quality to Bayview, and to focus on doing extensive landscaping. So those three elements is what I continue to foster into the design of the arterial. So those are the things that were my contribution to what ultimately came into being. And all those homes along Ellen between KK and Oklahoma Avenue were saved as a result of my getting involved. So John Norquist was our principal contact then. I worked with John Gurda and an attorney by the name of Paul Medved, and the Bayview Community Center to continue to wind up talking about the whole arterial program and stuff. After John became mayor of Milwaukee, one Sunday evening I got a call. My daughter picked up the phone and she said, Dad, it's the mayor, because she had known that we supported John to become mayor. And that's when John asked me to consider serving on the Board of Zoning Appeals. And that's when I wound up going to my firm at the time, Kaler Slater, and talked to David. And I said, David, John's asking me to be sit on the board. And David said, absolutely, whatever you need, just go ahead and do it. So I wound up joining and have been doing it for 36 years.
All right. So you mentioned John Gurda. He's kind of a legend in our History of Milwaukee classroom. So what have you done with him?
Well, I worked with John on the Lake Arterial. I mean, we were the ones that kind of were co-conspirators in working to develop a plan. He was kind of our historian to wind up identifying things that we could articulate in the plan from that standpoint. And again, he was just an overall supporter to wind up preserving the neighborhood to the greatest extent possible. After this arterial project, John and I continued to interact at different social activities, and even worked with him on things for the Polish Center of Wisconsin. Did some promotional materials for them through John, and still to this day maintain a relationship with him. I got his phone number on my contacts list, so he's available.
So you've been on the zoning board for a while now. What are some of the most important or interesting zoning projects that you've encountered?
Well, again, the land use issues that we get to deal with, unfortunately, are largely daycare centers that come in, used car dealerships, light automotive repair facilities, heavy equipment places that come in, contractor yards. These are all uses that aren't necessarily acceptable in the general area that they're in. So that's what we get to determine: is there a substantial negative impact with this operation adjacent to whatever else is adjacent? Are there harmful impacts in allowing that to occur? And should it be something that's given a specific time frame? So that's largely what we get to work on. There are some projects that come before us that need a lot of input and scrutiny, and then we also have to kind of temper that with those that are coming before us to oppose something that wind up only really wanting to focus on the ills of their neighborhood and not inform us as to how this particular application negatively impacts their quality of life. So we have to always listen to that, but again, separate ourselves from that and be able to justify that this is a legitimate enough business that should be given the chance to operate and prove that they can operate and not negatively impact adjacent properties and stuff. So there's an awful lot of that kind of nuance that occurs.
So for your work on the zoning board, how would you say it has helped or changed the way Milwaukee is right now?
Well, it's again trying to protect the adjacent neighborhood from any negative impacts, and that's done on a per application basis. I do know that the city Common Council has imposed additional considerations that we need to take into account in their quest to try to protect daycare centers from those that may have alcohol dependency. They wound up actually putting in laws, ordinances that we then have to respect, where somebody that wants to open up a daycare center, but they're within 150 feet of an adjacent liquor store, they have to come before us and define why they should be allowed to work or to do their business adjacent to this liquor store. So again, it's those kind of conflicting considerations that we continue to have to ferret through and work forward on.
So, is your work on the zoning board just like primarily meetings that you guys have?
Well, yeah, it is meetings. I mean, we are a quasi-judicial board. We do get to hear testimony, including then testimony not only from the applicant but from those that oppose, and then also to hear reports from our Department of Neighborhood Services as to what they believe are considerations for approval or additional conditions to be applied to the applicant. Uh, Department of Public Works does the same thing with site access, driveways, street frontages, and all of that related. And then there's the Department of City Development, who is the one that has the vision of the overall city and can wind up saying that this is a good project and a good fit into the neighborhood, or it is not, and articulate why. Each of those departments also then have the ability to add additional conditions to the application to make sure that they do certain things like, they take care of the landscaping on their site. That they, if it's a car dealership, that they're not storing tires on the site. But those are additional considerations and conditions that are imposed as part of their those department reviews. We get all of that information, plus then just all of the submittal information by the applicant that we need to understand what their intent is and understand that and be able to decipher how that is acceptable or not acceptable. There are, like this last session that I had, the pamphlet, the booklet of information, the ebook that I got, had 425 pages of information that I had to look at, unpack, look at, digest, and understand, and then be ready for the meeting in the afternoon. And I got that ebook at like 7 o'clock in the morning. So, and the meeting was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's a full day, plus then a 4.5 hour meeting to hear the cases. So.
Did you get through that 400-page book?
Yeah, I mean, you wind up being able to look at enough to understand what the issue is and what the comments and objections are, and be able to get on to the next one. I mean, do I read every part of it? No, it'd be impossible. Even as a speed reader, I think you'd have a problem getting through all of that.
And how often do you guys meet?
We meet 13 times a year. We meet, except for the month of August, because the Common Council requested that we not meet in August because that's when all of the membership is on vacation. And sometimes we get an older person that actually comes and sits before us to advocate or for or against an applicant. Rarely does that happen.
And then you have some pictures with you.
Yeah, again, as a kid growing up on that 2900 block of 8th Street, I was close to some significant rail transportation networks. The first that I will point out is this picture here.
If you want to just show it out.
Yes, this picture here, this is a photograph of 6th Street. This is 6th Street here. And in the background, where this train is crossing, you'll see a bridge crossing. That's Oklahoma Avenue. So on the top of the hill, and this hill is still existing, it separates 6th Street to the interstate and everything to the east. This used to be the Northshore Electric Railway. This ran between all points in Chicago all the way up to a terminal point on 6th and Michigan. So I grew up on these tracks, playing on these tracks of the Northshore Railway. You also notice in this picture that 6th Street has electric trolleys running on rails. This was, again, before diesel buses and all of that came into play. So all of this reflects electric traction in railway. The other picture that I have here is really 2 blocks away from where this picture is taken. This is the elevated Northshore Railway line, but these tracks down below, and this where this bridge occurs, this at the time was the Chicago Northwestern Railway main line. This is now Union Pacific Railway. This bridge and the abutments are all gone. This bridge and this railway is still very active. Again, this was a block and a half from my house, so on the adjacent grass fields we played, and I mean we farted around like gangbusters in these areas. I might also note that this portion, this elevated railway, not too far from where this picture was taken on, effectively on 4th and Hayes, was their main service yard and storage yard. And as kids, we were always in those yards. We weren't supposed to be there, but we always played in that as part of our backyard. What I wanted to point out here is it's really sad that this electric trolley is gone, because it would be a wonderful thing to continue to have, being able to go to all the Chicago suburbs, because this used to connect to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and an awful lot of training sailors would come up on this route to come up to the USO facilities here in Milwaukee that were downtown at the time. But again, a tragic day when all of this electric traction disappeared. The irony in all of this, to me, is the hop downtown. The principal building that the cars sit in and are maintained in is the site of, adjacent site is the site of the Milwaukee Road transportation hub, if you will. There used to be a big train station that was there. And the irony of having now a trolley that winds up running on rails where there used to be rails is just kind of ironic. So that's all part of my railroad experience as that I bring forward here. Related to trains and this love, the affair that I had as a kid, I have been a very active collector of Lionel, but HO gauge, not the big stuff. HO is half size of the normal big stuff. And I have been collecting that for 30 some odd years, and I have a pretty extensive layout in the basement of my house here, a 5x7 layout, and three walls that have a lot of unique stuff that's all behind glass. So a big avid collector of Lionel HO gauge. I want to clarify HO gauge.
So did this like collection start when you were a kid? Were you like gifted the trains?
No, actually as a kid, I envied all the rest of my neighborhood friends that had the big Lionel stuff. And they had it set up in their household, and we got to play with it. And I kept asking Santa Claus to wind up bringing me a set, and he wouldn't do that. And even when I offered that, look, there's HO scale, which is half the size and half the cost of the big ones, Santa didn't bring that to me. So when I became an adult and I had enough of my own money, I made up for the fact that my mom and dad didn't buy me the stuff when I was a kid. So that's my story on my train collection and affection for it.
So I'm assuming trains is one of your main hobbies. Do you have any others?
Well, I guess I call it a hobby because it's always been part of what I always promoted as part of my landscape design work, and that's to promote the sustainability of trees. Too often our trees do not get planted properly. They all get planted too deep, and as is kind of the case that we can look on our street here and see Norway maples that were planted now nearly 50 years ago that are dying because they were planted too deep, and additional roots that are girdling the base of the tree and effectively strangling the trees. Those are the things that I am very passionate about and look to avoid And on my projects, I have stopped crews putting in landscape materials because they weren't doing the right things with getting rid of the nursery soils and planting the trees at a good height above grade. So I've stopped that process, educated them. What happened after I left was another discussion. But that's part of my campaign with all of the trees that I'm involved with at the Humboldt Park, is to get those trees all planted at the right height so that they are not in jeopardy in 50 years of getting choked out by improper planting.
So what brought on this, like your love for trees and making
Well, my wife would tell you that I probably was a tree in a previous life. It's just been something innate in me for a long time. I mean, I remember as a kid watching another kid take a bat to a pine tree, and he was beating the side of the pine tree, and I was just thinking to myself, how stupid is this to wind up having this occur, and try to get him to stop, when all of a sudden the tree decided to let go of this sap, and it just sprayed all over him. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And I just started latching on to more the physiology of trees. I had mentioned earlier that while I was still going to school for my architectural background, I started taking courses in urban forestry, and it was there that I really latched onto and respecting woody plant materials, and it was that propelled me to foster all the more the sustainability of the trees and put that into my practice.
So would you say that like forestry like became a big like contributor in your architectural designs, like adding spaces or?
Well, yeah, a lot of a significant amount of my architectural projects that I was leading, I also led and did the design, landscape design work. Yeah, being able to advance good design principles, aesthetic design principles. My landscape design was much more modernist than it would have been, kind of old school kind of, or Harvard University style architecture. I tended to want to utilize trees as massing components in the site. MATC's campus, that health sciences building, underneath both sides of the bridge that connects the T building to the H building, and H is the health sciences building, there's a bosque of trees on both sides of the bridge, which was again intentional as part of the design. At Marquette's dental school, there's an exterior courtyard, and that is again a grove of pears. That's part of that. At La Crosse's health sciences building, there's a bosque of 25 trees. At that project, we had 5 different entities that came together to want to build the building. So 5 became a big part of why the building has got 5 stories, why it's got 5 different clinical settings. So I incorporated that into the site by doing a 5x5 planting of trees. We made it fully handicapped accessible, which was a bit of a challenge. But to wind up doing those kind of things in tandem with the architectural projects was great. I mean, it was very enjoyable. It made me that much more fulfilled when the rigors of the architectural side were, got a little too complicated. I always then looked back at the landscape part of it and reveled in the enjoyment of that part of it.
So you mentioned your work with like Humboldt Park, as it's right next to your house. Did that play any role in when you purchased this house?
No. Well, when we purchased this house, at the time that we purchased the house, we were truly looking for a true duplex where we would have the same footprint downstairs as upstairs. We would live upstairs and then take over the attic space because there was always a big attic. When we pulled up to this house, I realized that this was effectively a bungalow. It's a duplex, but it's a bungalow. And decided let's kind of go around the block. And as I came up on Montana off of Taylor, I realized, well, this is right across the street from this park. Let's go check this out. Wound up falling in love with the house for what it has, and then recognized the adjacency of the park, and that's when Barb and I we clicked immediately and bought the house on site. We didn't quibble about the price they were asking at the time, and wound up jumping all over it and learned to fall in love with the park after we moved in.
So obviously, you lived at this house for most of your adult life. Have you ever thought about moving, or?
Well, there were a couple times where we thought that we weren't sure where the neighborhood was going, where Bayview in general was going. But we decided to stick it out. Our daughter was going to school here, both at IC and Thomas More, and decided that we wanted to stay here. And after she went off to college, I was doing a lot of good work with Kaler Slater, and decided the proximity to downtown being 3 miles away, and at the time I was also starting to travel, so 3 miles to the airport was a perfect location to continue to operate out of. So we decided that we wanted to stay here. Did some improvements to the household to actually separate ourselves from the tenants upstairs. The original back hall was a common stairway between our unit and the upstairs unit, and I reconfigured that back hall to wind up giving them a separate entry and give us a separate entry and their privacy that we needed.
So when you first moved in, did you move in with another family?
There was just tenants that lived upstairs. No other family. It was just Barb and I when we moved in.
Oh, right. And so obviously you've done a lot for designing a lot of things in Milwaukee and how it's come. Like, how would you say, like, since you were a kid, that like Milwaukee has changed for like the better?
Well, I think the fact that there was so much effort put together by John Norquist to give Milwaukee a better face than it had before he became mayor. The kind of the new urban attitude that he bred into the Department of City Development, and how they latched onto that and continued to foster that vision. I think that was probably the most significant aspect of my watching the metamorphosis of Milwaukee from the big industrial city that it was to now much more of a service-orientated city.
And then, so you've lived, from what it sounds like, Milwaukee your entire life. Was that the plan, or did you have any aspirations to move away?
No, never really contemplated that. I did offer, when I came back, I was at a conference in Portland, Oregon, and spent 5 days there. When I came back from that, I told Barb, I said, if we were ever to wind up moving, Portland would be where I would want to go, just because of how nice the downtown was and the wonderful ability to walk out even downtown and smell the pine woods, the pine forest around you and stuff. I just thought that was great. They also had a very well developed subway system and their rapid transit system. They had it developed, and they were reaching out to communities 25 miles away and bringing those people to and from those destinations. So that's where I thought Portland was way ahead of Milwaukee. Not sure that they are today, but back then it was someplace I would have considered.
So you mentioned subways and like your love for electric trains, and you kind of mentioned the hop. Now, a lot of people in Milwaukee have very mixed opinions. What's your thoughts on the hop?
Well, I like the fact that as somebody that lives downtown, you can actually get from one point to the other point of just downtown without having to change buses. because otherwise you would have to change a couple different buses to wind up getting from where the hop starts at the train station to get up to the east side of Milwaukee. When I think of cities that work specifically to maintain and reestablish their electric trolley system, like Kenosha. Kenosha's got a rather vibrant little system that goes back to their original roots in that town. Um, I think that we should continue to advocate for more connections with the hop to extend it up to the Fiserv Forum from downtown to wind up really connecting to more of the east side and upper east side and to get down to the lakefront. Those things I think are part of what makes downtown Milwaukee vibrant, and tourists would get to know that stuff and enjoy it just like tourists wind up enjoying the trolleys in Kenosha. So.
So you mentioned this anecdote. It says that Bayview is Milwaukee's other east side. What does that mean?
So back in the 80s, when I was starting to get involved in some of this community work, I also became a member of the Bayview Neighborhood Association, business association. And they were having campaigns that they were putting together to promote Bayview. Both Bayview here off of Russell and Bayview off of Lincoln, those old business districts. They were individuals were looking to revive the business district in that area. At the same time, the east side, Brady Street, was becoming very vibrant, very well known, very interactive at the pedestrian level and the neighborhood level. And Bayview, who thought that they had everything that Brady Street had, wasn't being recognized. So that's when the campaign came into play to wind up putting out stickers that a lot of people put on their cars that said Bayview is Milwaukee's other east side. There was also another generation of stickers that came out where the word other was crossed off and it was put in red letters, better east side. So that's what I have to offer on that one.
All right.